All right. Welcome everyone to our panel discussion today on concussion prevention. This session today is co-hosted by the University of Michigan Exercise and Sports Science Initiative and the Michigan Concussion Center. My name is Stephen Broly. I'm the director of the Concussion Center, and I'm going to be your host today. Everybody should have seen the notification that today's session is being recorded, and it will be posted in a couple days for sharing with your friends and colleagues that couldn't make it and later viewing, and we'll be adding closed captioning to that recording as well. The format for today is pretty simple. It'll be conversational and based on questions from you, our audience. Looks like we have a pretty strong audience today. So if you have questions for one of our panelists, please feel free to enter it into the Q&A function at the bottom. We've disabled the chat, but the Q&A is open, so feel free to enter your questions there, and we will get to them as best as we are able. Before we get started, I would like to introduce each of our panelists briefly, and then we'll roll straight into some questions. Our first panelist is Dr. J.T. Eckner. He's a physical medicine and rehabilitation physician here at the University of Michigan and serves as the Associate Director of Research within the Concussion Center. His research is focused on concussion assessment and injury prevention, most recently investigating how neck strength may reduce injury risk. Our next panelist is Ross Tucker. He is a science and research consultant for World Rugby. He supports all strategic decisions involving player welfare, high performance, and law. Next, we have Grant Goulet, who's a Michigan alum. He is the Vice President for Product Innovation for Zenith, which in addition to football helmets has developed shoulder pads, face masks, and other apparel for sport performance. We have Mark Ewell. He is the Executive Director for Michigan High School Athletic Association since 2018, and he was the Assistant Director of the same organization since 2004, and he's the past Chair of the Board of the National Association of Sports Officials. And last but certainly not least is Kelly Sarmiento. She is a health and communication specialist in the Division of Injury Prevention at the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention in Atlanta. She has expertise in pediatric mild traumatic brain injury, and she is responsible for leading the Heads Up campaign, which is a series of educational initiatives centered on raising awareness and informing action to improve prevention, recognition, response to concussion. All right, we will get it started with a couple preset questions, but again, I'd ask our audience, if you have questions of your own you'd like, feel free to enter them into the Q&A at the bottom. The first question, I'm going to kick it to Grant. Grant, helmets were originally designed to prevent the worst of head injuries, skull fractures, and brain bleeds and those sorts of things, and they've done a great job at doing that, but within the last decade or so, there's been a shift in reducing concussion risk. Can you talk about the evolution of helmets, maybe across the entire lifespan of the helmet, design, materials, and then maybe give us a glimpse of where things are headed?
Yeah, I mean, you touched on a bit of the history there with helmets being primarily introduced for traumatic injury, so primarily skull fracture. And the introduction of rigid plastics, roughly 50, 60 years ago, was fairly successful at that. I mean, to the point where the numbers, dropped dramatically. But then what we were finding was more of a shift on head health in general. And so I won't make this a pitch for Zenith, but that's where Zenith came in, roughly 15 years ago, was the recognition that the science was outpacing the development of the equipment. And so taking those insights in that research, specifically around the rotational acceleration of the head, and how potentially devastating that could be to an athlete. And so wanting to incorporate that into the helmet architecture to make sure we were accommodating for not only that linear acceleration in force, but also that rotational component, which again was becoming fairly prevalent from a research perspective. So that I think boosted the innovation within the space for the next 10 years, fast forwarding to today. And I think that pace of innovation just continues to gain momentum, which is great. We love being in a space where there's excellent competitors to go up against. And now I think we'll get into this, but now there's material science, there's fundamental academic research that goes into this, hardcore engineering, rigorous field testing that all kind of comes together to make the latest and greatest product.
Excellent, excellent. So clearly helmets are, oh, excuse me, I think I might have to sneeze. Helmets are great for sports that wear helmets. And so, which is limited, hockey, lacrosse, football. Let's just kind of shift maybe into things that sports that may not in prevention techniques there. JT, can you maybe talk about kind of some of your concepts around neck strengthening and concussion prevention, how that may apply to helmeted sports, non-helmeted sports?
Sure, happy to. So I guess I'll start by saying, I and many others in the field think that having a stronger neck is a great idea if you're going to be an athlete who plays a sport where your head's going to get hit. I will just throw out a disclaimer there that if you look at the breadth of literature on the topic, the literature is not entirely conclusive to the point that we can say we have definitively proven that having a stronger neck does reduce your risk of concussion. I don't want to go too far down the rabbit hole of literature review, although I'd be happy to if people want to hear more about it. But in terms of why would having a strong neck help reduce your risk of concussion, I guess I'll kind of start with that. And I'll describe it kind of using a thought experiment, so to speak. So say you have two athletes, they got similar sized heads, similar sized bodies, and they're both going to be hit in the head with a similar amount of force. Athlete A, and when I do this with slides, I typically dress athlete A in like scarlet and gray and put a little O on their jersey. But say they have a very small, weak neck. And then athlete B, we typically dress in maize and blue and put a block M on them. They have a big, strong neck. And so effectively when this mass when the mass of the head is hit by this force for athlete A, this little weak neck is going to kind of have a bobblehead effect. That head's going to move a lot and accelerate rapidly. And that head acceleration results in brain acceleration and brain tissue strain. And that's what ultimately causes the concussion. Compare that to athlete B, who's got the much stronger neck. Effectively, when that force hits their head, it's effectively working against a bigger mass because their head is better coupled to their body. You can also think of like a really big spring versus a really small weak spring, just how much force a big spring can absorb versus a really small spring. So I guess that's a very non-engineering based simplistic mechanism for why having a strong neck seems like it ought to be protective for athletes. And that would go for whether you're playing a helmeted sport or non-helmeted sport. Obviously, if you don't have a helmet on, then you don't have that layer of protection, but everybody has a neck. So your neck can certainly offer protection
Great.
regardless.
Thanks for the overview. I think that's it's a great summary. So clearly, equipment is one aspect of injury prevention. Neck strengthening, it sounds like a pretty viable possible or second outlet of that. But we have two experts on policy here, and I want to touch base with them. So Mark, I'm going to look to you first. Can you maybe talk about some of the work that you've done with the High School Athletic Association to reduce concussion across Michigan specifically, but maybe you've seen things across other states? And then really maybe as you're going through that process, talk about like the considerations that you had to make, basically from north to south, east to west. We have a pretty big state with a lot of different resources at each of those locations that you have to take into account.
So it was quite when concussion really became an issue that was addressed in all of the sport playing rules, we decided that we could either let the issue kind of that we would react to what was happening, or we could try and get out ahead and try and show as much leadership to our 750 schools as possible. So what we require in Michigan for all of our member schools is that every head injury has to be reported to us. It's a fairly quick, easy online report. We don't use any names of individuals, but what this does is it alerts us every time there is a possible head injury. Now you would say, well, what's the incentive for schools to do that? Well, what we've done is we have concussion care insurance. It's gap insurance to where any of our eligible athletes at any of our schools, if they suspect a possible head injury, they can go, and anything that is not picked up by their primary insurance is covered with a zero deductible. So those decisions of, mom or dad at home saying, well, Mark got hurt in the basketball game last night and he's not feeling well, but geez, I know if we go in for an office visit, it's going to be a $200 out of pocket. We wanted to eliminate any possible financial barriers to kids to go in and get that possible head injury checked out. So we're able to monitor by sport how many head injuries we have. Obviously, the highest is in football, to where of our total participants, we see annually anywhere from 3.5% to 6% of those participants report a head injury. Next is actually girls soccer and girls basketball. What's been an interesting part of our data is all of the dual gender sports, we actually see a higher incidence rate on the girls side than we do on the boys side. So as you know, as JT just talked about neck strength, are there some physiological reasons for that? One of the challenges with our data, of course, is with COVID last year, we lost all of spring. So that series of a number of years comparing boys soccer to girls soccer, well, boys soccer happened last year, but girls soccer didn't. So that's going to create some asterisk for us moving forward, just in terms of the data comparison. But we knew that our state legislature, if they wanted to put in a new law, those kinds of things, they were not going to go knocking on 750 different high school front doors for that information. They wanted to knock on one, and that's why we've really tried to show some leadership here in terms of the reporting, in terms of the data collection. Also with the data collection, know that they tell us, did this happen during practice or competition? So you take our contact sports or our helmeted sports, well, are we seeing higher rates in practice or in games? We even get into the playing surface. Did this happen on natural grass? Was it on turf? Because we're also able to identify, was the head injury from player to player contact, or was it the player contacting the ground or some other thing? So I could talk far too long about all of the data we have. Do know that each of our annual reports of the sport by sport data, mhsaa.com, click on health and safety, and all of that data is there. But from a policy standpoint, Steve, that's what our association has tried to do in serving our member schools.
Great, thanks, Mark. So Kelly, I want to turn to you now, and we're starting to get a couple of questions, but I want to make sure we at least go once around the table here. You probably have the broadest view of the country, sitting at the CDC in Atlanta, and you're part of the Heads Up campaign. And for those that don't know, it's an educational campaign that the CDC launched probably close to 10 years ago now, just on concussion awareness and identifying signs and working on it. And it's really, at least to my knowledge, it's probably one of the most successful concussion education efforts that's ever been done. Can you talk about the process that the CDC undertook to get that campaign off the ground? Who was involved in it, how it got pushed out, and then maybe kind of where things are headed, where you see things going, as the research changes and going forward.
Yeah, absolutely. So you're correct. The Heads Up campaign was launched in 2003, and it was initially designed for healthcare providers. And we saw that a lot of mild traumatic brain injuries in particular were being missed or misdiagnosed at that time. And prior to the launch of the campaign, the Surgeon General had released a report finding that traumatic brain injuries were a silent epidemic. And so one ways we were trying to really give a voice to brain injury was through better diagnosis and management. So with the launch of the healthcare provider initiative, we did some evaluation work, and the healthcare providers recommended that we actually develop some companion materials for sports coaches. So that was really the impetus for starting some of the work in sports, was that feedback from the healthcare community. We then broadened out. We work with a large number of experts. I think we have about 85 experts, organizations that we work with, ranging from governing bodies of sport to medical societies, brain injury and health and safety organizations. And then we work with a lot of individual experts. We're really lucky to have wonderful external experts to work with, as well as our internal experts on the traumatic brain injury team. So I would say it's grown organically, and as concussion has changed, the landscape has changed, the research has changed, we've tried to adapt and quickly keep pace with the needs of the audiences of the campaign, which are now still healthcare providers, but we've broadened to school professionals, sports coaches, both high school and youth sports, athletes themselves, parents, and really trying to develop tools specific for the needs of those different groups. I would say initially the Heads Up campaign focused on recognition and response, whether among the healthcare providers or sports coaches, but probably about 10 years ago, we started trying to do a shift, and even gotten more momentum more recently, looking at primary prevention. And so the Heads Up campaign has shifted as awareness of concussion increased, we found that people were taking concussion more seriously. While there's still more work to be done, we saw better identification and awareness and wanted to shift to preventing them before they happen. And so it was really great to hear Mark talk about some of the data and specifics that they've been collecting. And we've seen that also from other groups and at the national level. To some extent, there are big gaps in surveillance right now, unfortunately, for concussion. So that does limit us, but we've learned from other systems, the leading causes of concussion and head impacts in different sports. We just released a study looking at tackle in youth tackle football versus flag football, and saw a very dramatic difference in the number of head impacts that a tackle youth football athlete gets versus the flag, and looking at games versus practices, and differences within other sports. So we're really trying to shift that primary prevention piece and making sports specific. I know Mark mentioned football, so knowing that tackling is a leading cause of concussion in football, so targeting interventions to that. When you look at girls soccer, he highlighted that group as well. It's collisions during heading, and so sort of interventions and education around that. And then you look at something like cheerleading, where 90% of concussions are from stunting. And so thinking through how can we have spotters and mats and safety protocols around that. So we're really trying to target and be specific, because prevention of concussion is not one size fits all. And so from a public health perspective, using the data, using the needs of the audience to try to fill those needs is really important.
All right, well, thank you, appreciate that. Just so everybody knows, Ross is having some technical difficulties, so we're working on that, and so we're hoping to get that fixed, and we'll circle back as soon as we can get him on here. So we do have some questions here from the audience that are starting to roll in. First one, I think probably to Grant, but anybody can chime in here. Question is, how does MIPS technology in helmets reduce rotational force, or does it reduce concussion?
There we go, unmuted. Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, MIPS is primarily found, I won't try and get the acronym right on the spot here, but it's a technology primarily found in single-use helmets, like a bike helmet, for example. So what it's effectively doing is providing a slip plane within the helmet. So it's effectively decoupling the head and the ground. So enabling part of the bike helmet, for example, to effectively shear across the head without transmitting that energy into the head, which is a really valuable and effective technique for doing that. When it comes to helmets like a football helmet or non-tackle headgear, which we're also in, we focus more on how do we actually take energy out of the impact during that shearing instead of just allowing it to slip. So MIPS is an effective technology to decouple it, but as we're thinking about it from a material science and geometry perspective, how do you design structures that accomplish the same sort of decoupled motion, but also serve to extract energy from the system during an impact?
Great, thanks. So I've been told that Ross can hear us and he can speak, but no video. So I'm gonna kick it to him. Is that Ross, can you hear us? And I just want to make sure before I ask a question.
Yeah, I can hear you loud and clear. I don't know if you can hear me.
Yep, we can hear you. All right, so I want to give you some airtime here. Can you maybe talk about some of the work that you've done specific with rugby, but then maybe how that work may translate to other sports in reducing concussion risk?
Yeah, sure, happy to. Sorry again about the video issues. Anyone listening can just pretend I'm on the radio. My work in 2016 onwards with World Rugby was focused on prevention. What preceded me was the management side of concussion. So between 2011 and 2015, the sport began to introduce these sideline screening protocols to assess players when they'd suffered a head impact in the game. Those sideline screens were then followed by post-match at 24 hours and 72 hours concussion screens, modified SCAT-5. And the focus at that point was obviously, how do we manage players with concussion? How do we prevent players with concussion from staying on the field at the time of the injury? By 2016, the focus was on prevention. So the first question we had to answer is what causes concussions? Now, that might sound like an obvious question, but it actually turned out not to be. So what we did was we assessed 650 odd of these head injuries that occurred in the game. The great thing about it was that because we'd introduced the sideline screening, that really gave us a database and a library of video of exactly what had happened to whom and when. And so we coded how those injuries happened. Now, the intention then, we did this very much with the end in mind, was we knew that we'd have 3 or 4 levers we might pull at some point to try and reduce the propensity and the number of concussions in the sport. And one of those was law change. The others was equipment, which you've addressed already here. There was prehabilitation, neck strengthening exercises, which we also recognized. But everyone felt that law change would be the low-hanging fruit because World Rugby, the organization I work for, is really responsible for writing the rules and the laws of the sport. So what we did was we analyzed and described the events in the sport that were more likely to cause head injury. And then we tried to rewrite the laws in order to change the behavior. The idea being very similar to what you would have seen in the NFL is if you can identify the circumstances in which a head injury is more likely to occur, then you can try and avoid those circumstances. Your kickoff return was an example of that. The problem we found, and it was the very first thing that was thrown up by the analysis, is that the player most likely to be injured is not the player being tackled, it's the tackler. So we had to then start thinking about how do you protect a player from his own actions, not those of the opponent, because most times when you think about law, you write it to protect the recipient of the action, not necessarily the instigator. And really many of our problems in implementation have stemmed from that issue, because we didn't have a mechanism to directly punish the tackler for something. So what we've tried to do is use the law as a stick to carry a message. And the key thing, to summarize it for you, is we want players to tackle lower, because we identified that when the tackle height is sternum or higher, the risk of injury is 4 times higher than if it's lower. And that's the message we've been trying to sell ever since. Now, I think the lessons for other sports are, number one is you must understand the problem before you try to solve it, because if we hadn't done the necessary diligence, we would have presumably tried to do what seemed logical, which is protect the other player. And that would have addressed the 1/4 of injuries, not the 3/4 that we should have been focused on. And then very briefly, one of the big challenges we've had is getting the buy-in from all the stakeholders in the sport. So we make the laws, but then referees have to apply it. Coaches have to hear it, because we're ultimately asking them to change their methods to change the behaviors. And the players have to understand it. And like broken telephone, at every step that we've sent it on, things have been distorted very slightly. And it's been a real challenge to get stakeholder buy-in to what we're trying to achieve.
Thank you, appreciate it. So we have another one here from the audience, and I'll just throw this out to everybody in the group. I think it touches on a couple different levels. Why are head impact sensors so widely used and supported in research, but not widely used in team environments for safety and technique purposes? So I will throw it out to anybody who wants to take a first stab at it.
And I can jump in there quickly, but yeah, we do have some experience with this at Zenith, looking into innovative technologies to assess what's actually happening on the field. It's certainly important and interesting from a research and development perspective. I think where it's met with some hurdles is cost, certainly. So when you try and bring this down from, certainly NFL, Michigan type levels of play, high level D1, cost becomes prohibitive. We know for the most part, if you look at the pyramid of participation, it's primarily at the youth level where most athletes are playing, and also where the dollars are most slim. So that's certainly one of the factors. I think the other one that we've heard from some coaches and parents and so forth is more on the liability side. So understanding who makes the call as to whether an event has taken place during a game that is problematic based on a red light, green light type scenario. We've seen issues with this with some products that have come out on the market. So I think it's a challenge to fully describe what's happening on the field with an accelerometer or an IMU as it relates to this multifactorial problem that is concussion or head health in general. So those I would posit as two hurdles there.
Anyone else want to jump in?
I guess I would throw out there another consideration is just the accuracy of the sensors and their ability to identify a concussive head impact from a non-concussive head impact. I mean, it's certainly true that the bigger magnitudes of acceleration have higher probability of causing a concussion, but there's really no line in the sand. It's not really accurate to be able to say, you don't have high accuracy to say that was a concussive impact versus that was not a concussive impact. So, depending on where you dial your threshold, you're either going to miss a lot of, potential concussions, or you're going to have a lot of flags go up that ended up not being concussions. So, practically speaking, there is potentially screening value, but it's really not definitive. And I think that's probably one of the other big reasons that it's not widely applied in practice. It certainly gives a lot of insight in a research context, but I think it would be desirable for it to be more accurate before it was widely used for clinical purposes on the field.
Sure. Great. Thanks, JT.
I would just add that we've looked into this as well from a public health perspective to see if sensors could be used as part of educational interventions. We know, I believe it was at UNC, they've done stuff looking and using the data to create risk profiles for athletes. But what we found sort of initially, and we do hope to explore this in the future more, is that it's very resource intensive type of intervention that would require a significant number of staff to implement such an intervention, not just the technology, but people to collect and report the data, and then using the data and explaining it to the individual athletes. And so we've been trying to think through how we could replicate that type of intervention on a broad scale. But it is a challenge right now. And I think that's why you see more of those type of interventions at the college level. And I think it's less feasible, let's say, at a youth or high school league at this point, and hopefully that'll change in the future.
Great. So this conversation has kind of opened the door on something I was hoping we would get to is the cost of things. And I think it's very easy to say everybody gets the $1,000 helmet or the $1,000 helmet sensor that can help identify. Mark, I'm going to go to you first, but Kelly, I'd really welcome your thoughts, and everybody for that matter. As we're thinking about concussion prevention, whether it's policy or equipment, how do we think about it in a way that is equitable across socioeconomic status? Or is socioeconomic status not the most significant barrier that's stopping these things from going forward? And what is that barrier if it's not SES?
I think you've hit on, the greatest challenge. You take a state like Michigan, our diversity, you can go counties in our Upper Peninsula or in the Thumb and not have counties where they have a single licensed athletic trainer. So how in the world does Trout Creek High School up in the UP, who has no athletic training services, how do they manage not only the head injury itself, but the aftercare, the rehab work to be able to return that athlete to play? And then you contrast that with, let's say, a school like Brighton or Novi High School in the Metro Detroit area, large schools, full-time athletic training staff, some assistant trainers, some outside resources, whether that's the Head Injury Institute that's in Brighton. So the challenge is we've got to create policy that works for all 750 of our high schools. The two examples I just gave, and every other kind of school in between. They all have certainly different financial backing, different personnel, different resources. So that, by the way, is a huge reason why we make the investment of that gap insurance coverage. It costs us $1.50 a student athlete. We've got about 200,000 kids that play each year in Michigan. So that is obviously a pretty significant budget issue, but that's how strongly that we feel like we need to try and level the economic field, at least in terms of their ability to get in front of a healthcare professional for the assessment, for the diagnosis, and then most importantly, the return to play process. So in a perfect world, Steve, I would love to have a magic wand and put a licensed athletic trainer in every single one of our schools, but it's really trying to think and work creatively to try and give all of our schools, regardless of location or resources, a way to play and play safely.
All right, I would support your magic wand dream. Kelly, any thoughts on this? And we can go around the table here for other people as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I think health disparities and health inequities are a big focus, not only on the traumatic brain injury team where I work, but CDC overall. And we actually just compiled some research on this and see on traumatic brain injury overall, there's definitely health disparities related to where a person lives, rural versus urban, insurance status, and some of the other factors that Mark mentioned. And so one thing in terms of sports in particular, that there has been some fairly recent studies looking at access to non-contact sport options, such as flag football, and seeing that certain communities have less access or options. And so that's concerning. So even if a child wants to, or a parent wants to choose a non-contact sports option, they may not have access to that, let alone, as Mark referred to, access to healthcare. So I know, Steve, you and I are working on a training right now for athletic trainers. And one of the things that we want to include in that is how to address and how to provide insights to athletic trainers working in rural areas or areas where athletes may not have quick or affordable access to care, and what an important role that athletic trainers can play in that, and what sort of strategies from a public health standpoint can we use to make sure that athletes are getting the same types of care and protocols are followed in a way that makes sense and are practical, and we're not skipping steps because of resource issues. And so trying to be strategic and also thoughtful about those issues is important.
Great, thanks. Anyone else want to chime in on this one?
I mean, this is certainly something that we think quite a bit about, of course, through an equipment lens. First and foremost, from an ethical perspective, and wanting to effectively democratize protection and make sure that the best protection is available to all athletes. But frankly, also from an economic and a business perspective, this is a really important space for us to play in, which is how do you make the most innovative, best protecting helmet at a low cost that most youth programs can actually afford. And this, to me, is where the most interesting innovation can take place in our industry. It's not at how do you make a bigger and heavier helmet that gets the top ranking on a third-party test. It's how do you innovate a truly protective solution that's designed for the athlete that's wearing it on the field. So yeah, this is something that's really important to us that we like to think a lot about.
Great, thanks, Grant. So here's an interesting one from the audience. I'm not sure who may or may not have expertise in this. Are there any initiatives for higher safety standards for combat sports while training to prolong the life of the athlete? You want to take a stab at that one? Maybe not.
Ross, yeah, I don't, to be honest, I don't know too much about the combat sports policies. We're part of a consortium that is contact sports, so the NFL, NHL, AFL, NRL, and so on. Never had a delegate from a combat sport presented those, so I honestly don't know the answer to that. World Rugby is currently involved. There's a litigation against us, and it's just part of the research looking at that has been to try and look at what some of those other sports are doing. And many of you watching this may know that the initial cases of what was called dementia pugilistica came from boxing. So of all the sports that would have a head start in a sense on this, I would imagine they would be there. And I know they have policies about mandatory stand downs and so forth, but further than that, I'm afraid I can't help the person answering that question.
All right. We have one here. I'm going to read the whole question. And the second clause is a bit embarrassing. You'll understand when I get there. With sex differences in concussion rates, what are your thoughts on the reasons for this? Is it biomechanical or perhaps psychosocial or biological? Also, I think Virginia Tech beat Ohio State more recently than the University of Michigan. That would be the end clause, which is probably true, sadly. But we'll go to the first part of that. If anyone wants to comment on the sex differences in concussion rates.
Yeah, so just quickly from rugby's perspective, there are no differences, which is interesting. I have seen the papers out of particularly the NCAA college system and they show significant differences. We've got data now going back to 2014 for women and 2011 for men, and the concussion rates are similar in both versions of rugby at the elite level. One interesting thing there is that the proportion of injuries that are concussions is higher in the women's game than the men's game. So I don't want to give you exact figures, but the overall women's injury risk is lower, but the concussion rates are the same. So that means women are disproportionately likely to be concussed. So that's a subtly different way of framing that. And the other interesting thing is that as women's rugby develops and becomes more professional, the size and the speed of those players is going up, and the concussion rates are trending up. It's too early to say if they're going up, but they're certainly heading in that direction. So the feeling at the moment is that in the next 3 or 4 years, we might start to see significantly higher concussion rates as well. I think at the moment, women are relatively protected, quote unquote, simply because the speed and the size and consequently the kinetic energy in those tackles is slightly lower. So where there is, and I think this is maybe where I can pass the baton over to some others, is there is an argument, and it has been studied in rugby, about neck strength in women, and that makes them slightly more susceptible to concussions in contact. So that's going to be a big focus for World Rugby's research in the coming 2 years, is trying to understand the size of the forces. We now have mouthguard sensors that can be used for that, and then work on interventions around neck strength to change it.
Great. Thanks, Ross.
I can go ahead and pick up since you mentioned neck strength, and certainly that is one possible explanation. On average, men do have stronger necks than women, and we talked about the mechanics of why having a strong neck could be protective, so that's one possible explanation. I think ultimately there's probably no single explanation for this observation. I think that it's probably multifactorial. Other things, I think the question may have mentioned biological differences, sex hormones. Those likely play some role. I don't know if that's entirely spelled out yet exactly how that role comes out to play. Another thing is just in terms of reporting, there's several studies that show that females and women and girls tend to be, I'll use the word, better at reporting symptoms than men and boys are. And if a concussion is identified by symptom report, if you're more inclined to report a symptom, you're more likely to get the diagnosis. So there's probably a combination of biological, mechanical, and societal/social factors at play here. I don't think it's any one thing.
Great, thanks, GT. I think that's well said. We have another kind of biomechanics equipment question here. Has Zenith or any other helmet company considered designs similar to the Hans device that the race car drivers use to mitigate rotational forces? I think a better Hans design may allow normal head motion in sports and reduce rotational head rotation during impact. Excuse me.
Yeah, I can take that one first. Yeah, this is something that we have looked into a fair bit. It is effective theoretically and biomechanically to increase the effective mass in the collision by coupling the head and the torso. So that is sound from a physics perspective. And I think it is also one of the, challenges, I would say, to back up a bit, is the tradition baked into the sport, specifically around tackle football. It is a highly ingrained sport with tradition for how equipment should look and perform. Now, that's not to say that that's a firm barrier to innovation, but it's certainly one of the hurdles that we've experienced when trying to do something a little bit different and new, that may be unexpected, although demonstrating performance benefits. So yes, I think there is merit to a design like that, and I think specifically to the questioner's point, if you can do it in such a way that it leverages a rate-dependent response, such that there is normal motion at low speed, but then also this sort of strengthening at a higher velocity impact to mitigate those forces. So yeah, there's something there that warrants additional investigation.
Great, thanks. So Ross, I know I'm going to show a little bit of my ignorance to rugby here. Outside of the scrum cap, is there any discussion around equipment, safety equipment within rugby surrounding concussion?
No, there's never been. The feeling has always been that a more substantial or bulky helmet would limit peripheral vision so much, and because of the way the game is played, is not viable. So what is being explored, and there's a study on the go at the moment in rugby competitions in England, is the development of a better scrum cap. So there's certainly in the last 5 or 6 years, the evolution of that technology. And for listeners who don't know, a scrum cap is basically a padded, tight-fitting helmet that a player wears on their head. A paper 3 or 4 weeks ago came out, the largest of its kind that I've seen, and showed that the scrum caps currently in use do not reduce concussion rates significantly. And so if protective headgear is to make a difference, it will rely on the development of technology in the future. But we don't believe that the helmets that are used in football would be valid or plausible in rugby. So that's been a barrier there.
Okay, great, thanks. We have one more kind of going back to policy legislation here. So maybe Mark, I'll look to you and then maybe over to Kelly. How do you see sports medicine professionals affecting a change in the concussion legislation model, specifically in regard to youth and rec sports, moving away from legislation that is tethered to the educational system? So outside of the high school network, how do we make the system better for concussion identification and management?
So that the questioner just, hit on, I think, the magic issue in question right now, which really has been illuminated through COVID. With all of the COVID restrictions that all of us in athletics have had to deal with, I can say with a high level of certainty that our school-based sports programs have followed the COVID restrictions and limits, because our coaches are responsible to athletic directors who then answer to a principal and the superintendent and boards of education. I can tell you without question, the non-school youth sports world has been the wild, wild west. Whenever we've been on a lockdown or a pause, it's basically in that world, do whatever you'd like. And so the connection I'll draw here is when it comes to just general health and safety focus at the youth non-school level, there's virtually, yes, parents have to sign the concussion acknowledgement form. And yes, you got to go out and watch a short online video. And yes, you try and educate and train coaches as best you can for the signs and symptoms of a possible head injury, but there's no accountability at that level, because God bless everybody who volunteers, but youth sports level for sports for the most part those are volunteer run organizations. We've tried to do some outreach and to try and bring some sanity to an insane world. And we've had folks come in here for an annual meeting, and we feel like there's some positive momentum, and then 12 months later you realize that almost 3/4 of those individuals, well, their kids are now out of the program, and so you've got a whole new group of leadership. And in the prevalence of licensed athletic trainers or really any other healthcare providers, it's almost impossible to find one. So I know the challenges that we have in the school space with funding and personnel. And I'm telling you that if the magic wand still has some magic in it, that is a space that drastically, and I can tell you that a lot of concussions that get reported in our system actually happen when kids are with their club or their travel or their AAU team, because there is no identification, there is no rehabilitation opportunities. And so we do see a high number of those that end up in our space because we're there to help kids at the end of the day. But it is the wild, wild west.
Kelly, anything from the CDC side of things on this?
Sure. I think the main thing that, it's a complex topic, as are a lot of public health efforts, but really policy alone is not going to solve it. Neither is, just equipment or just education. I think that's the importance of sort of interdisciplinary discussions like these, where it's going to be, they all need to intertwine and be comprehensive. So as with any health education campaign, such as Heads Up, it's designed for awareness, but it's going to be more effective when there's policy and programmatic information and efforts woven in. And so in thinking about policies and intertwining, and specific to the question on the youth sports community, I think, it's ensuring that there's sort of all those pieces are intertwined, but then also looking at, we've seen as better awareness among parents and the community, sort of that grassroots efforts, that leagues and programs sort of adapt as well. So For example, we hear anecdotally to some extent, that parents are becoming more aware. They then go and ask their healthcare provider detailed questions about what does my child need at school and what should I be doing for return to sport? And the healthcare provider is going to then prompt to provide that type of detail. And so, thinking through and, different audiences that need the information and knowing, unfortunately, there's not going to be one solution and one way we can get at this, whether it's the youth sports community or even the high schools in more structured environments.
All right. So we have 2 or 3 similar questions around neck strength testing. Largely, what if there's an objective measure for baseline and then follow-up strength testing for the neck? So JT, I think that one's yours.
Sure, I'll take that one. And sure, that's a challenge. So I can say in our lab environment, we have a piece of equipment. It's kind of like a halo that goes around your head, and there are pads that fix to your head, and it has a 6 degree of freedom force sensor, and you can look at forces and torques in every direction. That's not really going to be practical in the training room or in the community. A couple of approaches that I've seen used that are a little bit more user friendly outside of a lab environment would be using like a handheld dynamometer with the athlete laying on a bench and holding their head off the bench and seeing how much force they can resist before their head begins to break or to move. And then another approach that I've seen is having an athlete seated so their torso is kind of stabilized against a backrest with a strap around their head and a cable to the wall, fixed to the wall with a force transducer of some sort, and seeing how much force they can generate pulling against the wall. I don't know if there's an absolutely perfect way to do it, but those are a couple of strategies I've seen. Another thought is you can track neck circumference, which is also not perfect, but there is a relationship between strength and circumference. So I guess those are 3 applicable ways that it can be done without real fancy equipment.
Great, thanks, JT. So we have an interesting question here, which I think we've probably all recognized anecdotally, but not sure how to address it. So when considering increased awareness and concussion recognition, that increases the number of concussions that then become reported, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. But when making policy decisions for prevention at the youth and adolescent level, how do you balance decision making when considering recognition increases that may counterbalance the numbers resulting from the policy or the equipment change? So you educate people, they're more likely to report. Are we really, I guess it's kind of around this, are we really in the middle of a concussion epidemic, or are we just recognizing these injuries more and managing them differently than we did before? So I'll kick it out to everybody on that one.
So yeah, I think there's actually been studies that have looked at that. So I believe it was using the high school Rio system, looked at pre and post concussion numbers after, pre-post legislation, and they do see an initial increase, and the authors of those studies, I believe there's 1 or 2 of them, have attributed that most likely to better identification and then care-seeking behaviors, such as the coach or athletic trainer or someone else saying, this child needs to get care before they can return to play. But then what they've also reported is subsequent decreases a couple of years after the policy within that, but also decreases in multiple concussions. And so that I think you can look at it different ways, but there have been some studies that have looked at that and shown those initial increases, decreases, and then assessment of repeat injury.
Great. So,
sorry, if I might on that one, this is a really good question from Abby, and it's something that's been hovering over our heads certainly for a long time, because in 2011, when we introduced the pitch side concussion assessment, now called the HIA, we caused a significant increase in concussions simply because we'd lowered the threshold for diagnosis. And so by drawing attention to it, we created for ourselves a problem. It's like putting something in a spotlight. Now all the blemishes are there. And as we've begun, as I mentioned, to make changes to prevent concussions, we don't have a stable base from which to assess those interventions. And so when we changed the laws around head contact and high tackles, anticipating a drop, and found nothing, we don't know whether that's because the concussion incidence is still increasing as a function of awareness and reporting, and in actual fact, no change is good change. So it's a very tricky one, and we've been able to run almost a real world experiment, because the head injury protocols have been introduced in different competitions around the world at different times. And we've seen that it takes 5 or 6 years of use before you start to get a plateau in the numbers. And that's because the numbers were always there. It's just you get better and better at finding them. And even now, 10 years after the fact, we still don't necessarily have a historical standard against which to compare. So it's very difficult. And it's so difficult to get the media to report that right, because they just see an increase as an emerging problem. And we're actually saying you should celebrate that increase, because it means we're seeing something we didn't see before.
Yeah, and I'll just add to that. Yes, I mean, we see the same thing, and we did for many years looking at emergency department data. We saw steady increases beginning, I want to say 2009 to 2010, when a lot of the awareness and some of the policy efforts were gaining momentum and media attention. But interestingly, this summer, we did publish a paper looking at trends among contact sports, and we are starting to see a drop, but just adding more to the complexity, it could be also because of changes in sports participation. So for example, we saw a drop in traumatic brain injury related emergency department visits among football, but is it because of better prevention? Is it because less kids are playing tackle football now, because we've seen drops in participation numbers? And so it, just to your point, that there's a lot of factors that address those and contribute to complexities and analyzing data. We are piloting a program at CDC that would help answer some of those questions, which would be a national concussion surveillance system. And so we're hoping that that sort of system would help really provide that baseline that you're talking about, and really help to inform sort of shifts. But because something like that doesn't exist at this point, sports organizations, as well as overall traumatic brain injury, it's just really a tough thing right now to be able to get those solid assessments of what's been effective and what isn't.
Sure. Thanks.
One thing I'd layer on there, Steve, if I could, from an equipment perspective, I think there's a little bit of a cautionary tale here for us to be aware of. Because as there was this swell of interest in concussion and really a hyper awareness around it, there's a risk of then over engineering the equipment that gets utilized because of this focus on, you know, the 1% of impacts that are on the more severe end of the spectrum. So you get this trend of bigger, heavier, as we talked about, which then feeds into JT's work with neck strength and, you know, minimizing that bobblehead effect. And also stiffer helmets, which very likely are designed at the expense of the lower end of the impact spectrum. So we've been talking about these, you know, big, less frequent hits, but what about the hundreds, if not thousands, of subconcussive hits that happen throughout a game practice, you know, season, certainly. So it's important to really consider the full spectrum of impacts that an athlete's being subjected to when we're, you know, thinking about these things.
Yeah, so I'd like to, thanks Grant for bringing that up. We had invited Eleanor Ruda, who's the chair of mechanical engineering here at Michigan, to join us today. She had another commitment, couldn't make it, but she's working on that exact thing, different materials that can manage the impact forces across the spectrum. And we're excited to see where that work goes. Hopefully sometime soon we'll see it. So. We're getting a little short on time here. I'm going to ask, I want to go around to all the speakers and kind of get their thoughts on one last question. What do you see as the next big thing in concussion prevention? JT, we'll start with you.
Specific to prevention, correct?
Specific to prevention. That's the topic today.
All right. I was going to say biomarkers, but that's less of a preventive thing. So I guess in terms of specific to prevention, all the things that we talked about would be on there. I would say maybe as far as a new thing, something that we're trying to begin looking at is identifying those athletes at greatest risk for concussion, so that some of the preventive strategies can be more applied in a more targeted manner towards them, not just everybody equally, but if you're at higher risk, you get a little bit stronger preventive pitch, whether it be education, whether it be monitoring, whether it be your neck strengthening and monitoring of that, or what have you. So I guess individualization, maybe.
That sounds good. Kelly, you're the next, at least in my window.
Sure. I think one thing that we're really trying to enhance and grow in the field is a focus and assessment of health disparities. So we touched on this a little bit early on, but for example, we know in like our youth behavior risk surveys that Black and Hispanic high school students have a higher risk for concussion, as well as higher risk for multiple concussions. And so why is that? What can we be doing better to reduce health disparities and sort of other things we've touched upon in terms of access to care and rural to urban disparities as well.
Sounds good. Grant, some thoughts?
Yeah, well, from an equipment standpoint, which of course is one piece of this complex puzzle, I would go back to two things that we touched on. One is material science, so innovation in materials and also ways of making. So, 3D printing is an exciting technology for us right now. And secondly is making sure that those innovations do become cost effective to the point where they are widely available at all levels of play. So I think those two have a pretty potentially broad impact.
All right, sounds good. Mark, you're up.
I think from a policy standpoint, we've made great progress in the two sports, at least by our data, with the highest incidence of concussion, and that's football and ice hockey. If we were back 10 to 15 years ago, NFL films or keep filling in the blanks, they would have put together highlight videos of guys literally getting, blown up, using that as a figure of speech, by these big, huge hits. And oh my God, and those have now virtually disappeared. You even listen to commentators now during football and hockey, and we'll say, well, years ago, that might have been a great play, but today that's a foul. And we've got to, the game has changed and evolved. And I really believe that we have changed the culture in those two sports. I mean, fighting has almost evaporated from hockey at the professional levels. And you look at some of the things we've done from a rule standpoint and officiating standpoint, and I think from a policy standpoint, are there things that we can now do with the playing rules in our other sports to not just reduce the number of concussions, but just to change that culture of it really needs to be safety first over the big highlight type hit that really up until the last decade had always been kind of glorified.
Great, thanks. Okay, Rosh, you get the final word.
Thanks. I'm glad that Mark brought up culture, because I think that's still the big barrier for rugby. Just this past weekend, in one of the high-profile international matches, one of the key players, in fact, the captain of the England team, went in for a tackle and hit his head on the shoulder of his opponent, and he was clearly out when he hit the ground. He got up quickly and wanted to play on, and I was very encouraged, because the commentators and the referee and even the independent and the matchday doctor said, no, that's you done. You need to come off. And when those cases become more prevalent than the ones of denial, then we would have turned the corner. I think rugby's already gotten there, but that needs to still continue. And the place you see that most effectively is when you try to change the law. The resistance comes from coaching and playing, because they are resistant to change. They have incentives that are not necessarily the same as ours from a sports medicine and an injury prevention perspective. And so to try and win them over is probably the key. In terms of research, our most exciting upcoming project is a very large mouth guard study. We now have technology in mouth guards. I'm sure you've all used it and seen it, which we think will provide reliable and valid data. And we're going to assess the subconcussive impacts that Grant alluded to earlier across a range of rugby, from adults all the way to 13-year-olds. And the idea there is that we'll finally understand exactly how many there are, what causes them to be larger, and then we can try and be more specific in our prevention strategies. But none of these things, the science, none of it happens if you don't get buy-in from the people who actually have to implement the tools that you give them. And so you almost have to convince someone to drink water when they don't think they're thirsty. And that's a big challenge that we face.
I love the analogy. Thank you, Ross. So, well, we're out of time, but I want to give a really heartfelt thanks to all of our panelists for their time today, literally joining us from around the world. So thank you very much. I've found this to be incredibly informative, and I hope all of our guests here today have as well. Thank you to our guests for taking some time out of their busy schedules to join us. I know everybody's on Zoom all day, every day now, so appreciate you carving out a little bit of time for us to join. As I mentioned earlier, that we did record today. And we will post the session, the recording on the Concussion Center website, concussion.umich.edu. It will also be available on the Exercise and Sports Science Initiative website in a couple days. So feel free to watch again or share it with your friends. And then I will just put in a quick promo. The Concussion Center will be hosting Carolyn Emery from the University of Calgary on April 29th from 4 to 5 p.m. Eastern Time. She'll be speaking about reducing sport concussion and the consequences in youth sport. So we look forward to it. Thank you, everybody, again. Thank you to our panelists, and please enjoy the rest of your day. Take care. Thank you.
Ciao.